So for the next few minutes, what I want to talk about is how you get an A or an A star when you're writing about small island. And just like we talked about with 12th Night, what you've got to try and do is convey your understanding of what it is Levy is trying to do with this novel. And so you've got to show your understanding of these high level concepts. What are they? They're all fairly obvious, really. But what she's doing, first and foremost, is she's exploring society's shortcomings. Which society does she talk about? Well, she talks about probably three. First and foremost, the UK, 1940s. She tells us a lot about Jamaica. And to a certain extent, she also explores USA as well. I guess here what she's trying to do is very post-colonial. By that I mean she's giving us a different view about Britain. She is undermining the British worldview and undermining that imperial pride that's best represented by people like Bernard. And of course she's portraying the racism that was inherent in British society in and around the 1940s in members of the public. So that's first and foremost what she's trying to do, and that's what you've got to get across. Also, she tells us an awful lot about Jamaica, and what she explores in the text is Jamaica's deference to the mother country, how Jamaica values everything that is British, and of course that's a consequence of the British education system there. And that's best represented by the character of Hortense, of course, and to a certain extent Gilbert as well, who very quickly learns that is a lie. And then we've got the other perspective, of course, of Gilbert's cousin as well, who offers us a very different perspective. But Levy also explores USA attitudes as well. Those of segregation, and she undermines those beliefs and attitudes and makes them appear really rather ridiculous in the episodes where we have the US soldiers in the village, and she explores that very well, very successfully. So she's exploring society's shortcomings first and foremost in the novel. What else does she do? She, I guess, invites us to laugh at human behaviour, which of course is at the root of all comedy, isn't it? In the novel, human folly is everywhere. She shows us ignorance, doesn't she? And small-mindedness. That relates to the title of the novel, doesn't it? Small Island. Small-mindedness in all its forms. And arrogance. Naivety. Arrogance, we see that with Hortense to a certain extent, certainly Bernard. Naivety, a little bit to do with Gilbert, mostly to do with Hortense, and I guess general foolishness as well. perhaps when it comes to love. So those are the high-level concepts you need to show that you understand, and that these should be, you should try to get to these points when you're looking at some of the chapters in the novel. So how does she convey these high-level concepts? Well, we have to talk about comedy. Of course, because it seems strange, doesn't it, that it is it's a comedic text when a lot of what she's telling us about is really very serious and disturbing. But she uses comedy to convey all of these ideas, and she's not really heavily didactic or polemical or preachy in the way that she conveys these ideas. But you have to understand how the comedy works. You've got to get your head around that and work out whether you think comedy helps her to make her message more clearly and more powerfully, or whether it undermines and detracts from the seriousness of what it is she's trying to convey. But what are the comic features of any text? Well, in our comedic texts that we've been studying this year, we often talk about romantic love, don't we? And we've got two sets of lovers, if you like. We've got Hortense and Gilbert, and we've got Queenie and Bernard, and that their love is complicated by separation and of course love triangles as well. So we've got Michael involved in both those love triangles, Gilbert and Hortense, and Queenie and Bernard. But yes, the course of true love isn't a smooth one in this text, and that's similar to all the texts that we have studied. So yeah, we've got romantic love. Another key comic ingredient is marriage. And obviously there are a couple of marriages here. We've got Hortense and Gilbert and Bernard and Queenie. But unlike typical comedies where the marriages come at the end, these two marriages are pretty much at the start of the story, and they're unromantic contracts. The couples don't fall in love in a conventional way. These marriages are very real, very different, and that's because this is primarily a historical text with comedic features, so it's always going to differ from the other standard comic text, or the dramatic comedy, Importance of Being Earnest, that you've got to talk about too. So these marriages are very different in that they're unromantic, but they develop, don't they, into a kind of romance. We've got Gilbert and Hortense falling in love pretty much towards the end of the story, beginning to understand each other and relate to each other, and their relationship develops, doesn't it? And Queenie and Bernard, to a certain extent too, they learn to compromise and they have a kind of an honest understanding. So these are marriages with a difference, aren't they? And then other typical comedic features are comic resolution, comic resolutions as well. There is a conventionally happy ending. Of course, we'll talk about that when we look at the final chapters of the novel in another video. But essentially, it's a happy ending, because the story mainly focuses on Hortense and Gilbert, and their journey. Queenie's is less happy. It's more of a compromise. So we've got comedy, and then there are other big methods through which Levy explores those high-level concepts that we were talking about. Well, she relies on historical fact, as well as comedy, to give her story a kind of real documentary realism about it. So we've got this sort of interesting balance of comedy and seriousness within the text, and that's because she's talking about real events that actually happened, and basing her stories on historical fact. So we've got the intermingling of comedic features and more serious historical events. So yes, there's historical fact. That's one of her big methods, a reliance on that. And then we've got the four characters and their monologues, their individual stories, their comic voices. So four characters, each with sort of very different ways of communicating their own stories. And through this method, Levy kind of segregates, to use John Mullen's expression, refer to that essay that's in the student pack that you've got. Through these four different stories, Levy is able to segregate different points of view in Britain in the 1940s. She's able to explore prejudice from kind of a 360 perspective. So each of these characters has a different style. Bernard, he takes himself too seriously, doesn't he? And in a way, a bit like Malvolio, he thinks rather a lot of himself, and in so doing reveals racial ignorance that that Levy's at great pains to explore in her novel. He has the idiolect, the style of talking, writing, that's typical of a man who's served in the Far East. And I always use the phrase that he's kind of emotionally constipated. His text is, his way of writing is very sparse. And we'll talk about that when we look at any of the chapters that Bernard is narrating. But Bernard is a naive or an unreliable narrator. It sort of varies between the two. And there's this sort of unconscious irony that comes out of his narratives. And Queenie, her narratives are characterised by honesty and bluntness. She's a butcher's daughter from the north, white, working class, informal vernacular, easy to read, very likeable character as a result, because she's sort of down to earth, self-deprecating. And we've got Hortense, who we sort of instantly dislike. Her pride, her superiority. She epitomises a kind of educated snob, albeit she's Jamaican, but it's her formal elocution, and she's schooled on Wordsworth, and she's her prose is quite stilted, quite unemotional, full of snobbery and haughtiness, and occasionally she slips into colloquialisms that reveal her true identity, and we can see that she's kind of putting on a facade, and appears well, as a result she's quite dislikable. And then we've got Gilbert as well, whose stories are always brilliantly narrated. He is witty, he shows insight, and he's charming with the stories that he tells through a Jamaican dialect. It's very entertaining in its informality. Hortense too, I forgot to say. Again, she's this naive narrator, and there's this unconscious irony that comes out of her accounts, because she doesn't really understand the full picture in a way that we do. So these are the big methods that you need to talk about. The different comic voices between the 4 different narrators, the comedic elements, romantic love, marriage, comic resolutions, and those things should form the basis of your discussion, and these are the methods through which Levy conveys her messages about either society's shortcomings or human behaviour, the folly in human behaviour.